I'm Subru, and I'm the director of the Penn Social Science and Policy Forum, which is a university-wide initiative to bring together students, faculty, the general public, policymakers, and policy-relevant social scientists around major problems and research agendas. This is now our third year of ongoing workshops and seminars. Our first year's theme was the global economic crisis. Last year was immigration and citizenship, and this year is poverty and opportunity. I'm delighted to launch this year's workshops with Professor Angus Deaton from Princeton. But before I introduce him, I just want to single out two of our three postdoctoral fellows who are here this year at the Social Science and Policy Forum. Erica Dobbs, who received her PhD in political science from MIT, will be with us for the entire year. And in addition, there's Linda, who is visiting here from Germany on a DAAD fellowship, will be here through the winter. Both of them are working on different facets, Erica on labor and public policy, Urs on the politics of affirmative action in an international context. So I'm delighted to have both of them aboard this academic year. The Social Science and Policy Forum has a series of events that are going to play out over the course of the rest of this academic year, mostly happening on Fridays. But our next event isn't happening on a Friday. It's Professor Peter Singer from Princeton. The event is by reservation, and you should go online to our website and reserve a spot. In addition, we have a series of sociologists, historians, anthropologists, policymakers coming over the course of the next 2 semesters for what's going to be a really great program. But it's wonderful to introduce Professor Angus Deaton this afternoon. He's the Dwight D. Eisenhower Professor of Economics and International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. His many research projects include the study of health, well-being, and economic development. Professor Deaton has taught at Cambridge and the University of Bristol and is well known on both sides of the Atlantic for his path-breaking scholarship. He is a corresponding fellow of the British Academy, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and of the Econometric Society. In 1978, he was the first recipient of the Econometric Society's Frisch Medal. He was also president of the American Economic Association in 2009. In 2012, he was awarded the BBVA Foundation Frontiers of Knowledge Award. His current research focuses on the determinants of healthcare in rich and poor countries, as well as on the measurement of poverty in India and around the world. His latest book, which he'll be sharing some of the findings from, is entitled The Great Escape: Health, Wealth, and the Origins of Inequality, which got lots of favorable reviews and attention, and was also selected as one of Bloomberg Businessweek's best books of 2013, and one of Forbes magazine's best books of 2013. So it's great to have him here. Welcome to Penn.
Thanks very much. It's very nice to be here. This is a very broad brush talk, so this is not the sort of thing that economists usually do. It's not an econometric analysis or anything. And I just want to talk about some broad brush issues, most of which have to do with the elimination of poverty. I'm sort of an advocate of Marcus Sen view that you should think about poverty as being much broader than just lack of income. And in this book, I take that to be lack of income and poor health, but you could think of it as many other dimensions too. But what I'm going to talk about today is mostly income and health dimensions of poverty and of the differences between people in those dimensions. So what I call the great escape in the book are these great episodes of human progress that have taken us from destitution, or have taken a large chunk of the world from destitution to ill health, premature mortality, from poverty broadly defined, to the long life and material living standards, which characterizes increasingly large share of the world today. I'm not going to talk about it, but it's important to note that it's not just health and material well-being that have gotten better. There's much more democracy in the world today than there has ever been. Large-scale reductions in violence, in everyday life. I'm thinking of Steve Pinker's book, Better Angels, for example. There's huge increases in education going on around the world, and if I had the knowledge and the time and the book is half as large again, that would certainly be the next topic that I would have talked about in the book. And in fact, I mean, in some ways I regret that. It's sort of a missing link in a lot of our life. I believe there's also been huge increases in the way people see their lives. They see their lives as better. That's more controversial, but I believe that, so I'll put that in the case. These great episodes of progress throughout history that are still going on today have typically only allowed some people to escape, or maybe not even. So the progress has been an engine of inequality in a way that we don't usually think about, or don't think. I think we should think about this more. It's obviously good if everybody's in a bad place, if some of the people escape, but that creates an inequality. And much of this talk is about some of those episodes and what to think about the inequality that was left by this progress. Was this inequality a good thing? Was it a bad thing? Is it sometimes good, sometimes bad? There's good aspects and bad aspects. And as I said, it's a very, very broad brush approach to those issues. So the most famous, perhaps, of all of these episodes historically is what historians have since prominence book called Great Divergence, which is the sustained economic growth, which began in Northwest Europe sometime after 1750 and really got going by 1850. And this sort of sowed the seeds of the big increases in material living standards which we enjoy today. This, of course, opened up these huge gaps between, first of all, Britain, Holland, and other parts of Northwest Europe, and the rest of the world, which was sort of left where it had been sort of all along. And those 18th century, 19th century expansion in world inequality is a lot of what we're left with today. It's the same countries that happened then. If you look at the gaps between Africa and Europe and so on, they began there, and those are the gaps that are still there. Now, of course, nothing's unchanging. These gaps, country by country, gaps in material living standards are by and large still not closing. Of course, country by country is a little artificial because there are lots of tiny countries out there. If you look at it people by people, person by person, we're doing a little bit better, if only because India and China are two very large countries, and over the last 20 or 30 years have grown relatively rapidly. So if you look across persons, it's at least possible that global income inequality is decreasing. One of the themes of the book, and I'll talk about today if someone's interested, is that our data systems are not really very good to the point where we can really be sure that that's happening. One of the things I do sort of more technically is working on the international comparison project, and the collection of worldwide prices is a much harder exercise than you might think. And so adjusting that is a really difficult thing. Many people would argue that internet, well, it is true also that if you look at life expectancy as your measure of health, country by country, life expectancy dispersion is falling, except for various interruptions, like the HIV/AIDS episode, which took Africa back sort of 50 years, parts of Africa back 50 years. The problem, of course, is that some of that is, I would argue that life expectancy is not really the right measure here, because what's happening in poor countries is that children are being saved. In rich countries, it's people in their 50s and 60s who are being saved. And it's not clear that you should summarize those two things together by looking at life expectancy. But anyway, people do that, and I'll leave it for the moment. So let me talk a little bit about what happened a long time ago, that life expectancy began to rise in Britain in the middle of the 18th century, in parallel with the Industrial Revolution. There's some common causes, if you like, the application of reason to human progress in both income and health spaces, and that led to a lot of inequality and life chances, not only with other countries, which I sort of mentioned already, but also within Britain. And here's a graph that I like very much that was first drawn by Bernard Harris in a paper in Social in Social History of Medicine in 2004. These data, these are not Harris's graphs, so I went back to the sources to make sure that I understood where this came from. So these are the results of Tony Wrigley's sort of lifelong endeavor to calculate life expectancy in Britain over long historical periods. These come from parish records, and there's all sorts of problems with that, which are debated endlessly in the literature, but these are probably about the best numbers we have. And these go from before 1550 until a little after 1850. And this is the general population of England. And you can see this is a very, very variable series. The horrible things happen, there are plagues, and diseases come, the lower life expectancy is enormous. Later, almost everybody catches smallpox. There are huge waves of it where people die. So there's a lot of bad stuff going on there. So you see this enormous chunking around. What you don't see is any very obvious trend during this period. And you could break the period up, if you like, and try to find trends. But we're all taught in our statistics courses you're not allowed to do that. And so, you know, the major thing is that there's not that much difference between what's happening here in 1600 and what's happening in 1850. So what Harris's very clever idea was to take Hollingsworth's data on ducal families in Britain, who are the aristocracy, who have endless amounts of money and big houses and palaces, and who also meticulously keep records of their births, their hatches, matches, and dispatches, as we used to say. So we have life expectancy very precisely for these ducal families, and so what he did was impose one series on top of the other, and you get this remarkable picture, which is that there's obviously two different periods here. In the first half of the period up until about 1750, the two series are not really very different from one another. And if anything, the ordinary people might have some very slight advantage. You know, people talk about people leading people into battle, things like that, but I doubt there's very much there. And then what happens after 1750? So one question is why for 200 years up to 1750 don't you get any divergence? Why are there no health inequalities out there? And why after 1750 you suddenly get this health inequality emerging? So there's like a 20-year difference in life expectancy by 1850. What caused that, and why wasn't it there before? And I like this sort of what's called this fundamental causes story of health inequality. That, you know, if you're really rich and powerful, everybody wants to live longer. No one's really very keen on dying. If you have resources, you will use them to try to avoid dying. The rich people had way more resources than the poor people. They could do sort of anything they wanted, but there just wasn't any knowledge there. So it didn't really help them to stop their kids dying of diarrheal disease or smallpox and all the other things that were going on. But after 1750, something began to happen. So there's really the question of why. Unfortunately, we don't really know the answer to that question, but there's a lot of stories out there. The one that's most convincing to me was variolation for smallpox, which spread from Turkey to Britain in the early part of the 18th century. And interestingly, this is not vaccination, which of course is 1799. So we're talking about 70 years or so before vaccination for smallpox was available. And this is the practice whereby you use a lancet to remove some material from someone who's got smallpox and rub it into a healthy person's arm. And they get a minor dose of smallpox involved. And then they get the immunity that comes with having smallpox. So this was brought to Britain in the 1720s, I think, from Turkey. The interesting thing was the first people who got this, King George I, I think, allowed his grandchildren to be inoculated, but only after doing a little bit of experimentation that your Human Subjects Committee nowadays would frown on. He tried it out on condemned prisoners, and he captured some unwanted children from the streets of London, and they were all variolated, and none of them died, so he let them go all grandchildren. If you've ever been and looked at human subject rules, you will know that prisoners and children are the two groups. Under no circumstances you want to do it, but if you're the kid, I guess that doesn't really matter very much. And it spread throughout the country. It was very, very, very expensive at first, unnecessarily so, but it was, the knowledge was guarded, and the aristocracy got it long before anyone else, and that's been pretty well documented. What we don't know for sure is you can't trace that way through all the way to the number of deaths. But before 1799, whole parishes were choosing to variolate poor people because it was cheaper than burying them when they died. George Washington variolated the whole of his army in the United States. Cotton Mather spread it in Boston. It was brought to the United States across the Middle Passage because the procedure was relatively well known in Africa. Now, I've listed a number of other things that we think might have been important during that period. One of the things I like about this period is all of these things they come from the periphery to the center instead of the way we think of healthcare today, this inventions of the center, which are then spreading out to the poor world. These are inventions that were known in Africa or known in Asia for a long time that sort of came to the center and saved lives. So the point I guess I'm making here is all of these are benevolent, they're expensive, and later spread more widely. Obviously, it would have been better for everyone if they could have spread more rapidly to everyone from the beginning, but that's sort of not the way the world is. And so if you think of this as a source of health inequalities, and I think in those days it was the source of health inequality, is that these health inequalities are signaling a sort of harbinger of health improvements. So it's sort of a good thing. It's sort of like the escape. You know, a few people get out, a lot of people are left behind. Those inequalities are a sign that it's possible for the other people to get out too. So that's a benevolent. Don't worry, I'm not going to say all of this is benevolent. So before you start getting upset, I'm not going to say that. I just want to show you a picture of this guy who was the third president of Princeton, then known as the College of New Jersey, who actually died from smallpox variolation. So not everybody didn't catch the disease. So he had this procedure carried out on him and died a couple of weeks later. I think these spots are on my computer, not.
Are you suggesting he may have had other problems besides smallpox?
I think President's Princeton always have a problem. I wanted to show you this as a sort of summary of all the things that one can put together over this 250-year period. This is sort of where we are now. This is the famous Preston curve named after Sam Preston, here. What this graph shows is life expectancy of Earth on the vertical axis and GDP per capita in 2005 international dollars along the horizontal axis. And I want to say a number of things about this. The size of each blob is proportional to the area is proportional to population of the country. So you can see China, or the two big blobs there, in India, sort of in there. There's the United States down up there. There's a curve for 1960, and there's a curve for 2010. They link up GDP per capita with life expectancy. The curves have no particular significance, they're more or less drawn by hand. And the arrow there is, I call this the onward and upwards picture to illustrate that both material living standards are getting better over time, we're moving to the right, and health, at least in terms of life expectancy, is getting better, but we're moving up. So just a number of things to say about this picture. One is the 2010 line is above the 1960 line. That's sort of interesting because it's telling you that there were substantial increases in life expectancy even in countries that didn't have any GDP growth. So historically, at least over this 50-year period, need GDP growth in order to get health improvements. And we know why that happened. I mean, lots of countries in West Africa, for instance, that had very little growth, but by vaccination and antibiotics and so on, had major increase in life expectancy. So that's a good thing, or I think it's a good thing, because you can always ensure that GDP is going to grow. The other thing that's very notable is just this very strong correlation between health on the one hand and on the other. I don't think that's a causal correlation. Much of the book is dedicated to arguing that income is not really what's driving it. But there's an ethical sense in which it's very, very important if you're interested in poverty and opportunity in the world, which is that the people who get hammered in material living standards are also the people who don't live right. And the people who live a long time like us are also the people who enjoy very high living standards when they're alive. So if you're to take those two things together, there's in a sense much more inequality in the world than there is if you just think about income and you just think about health. Right? In fact, if you define poverty more broadly as including both income and health, then the depths of poverty are much worse than we think if we just look at material living standards or if we look at life expectancy. There's a couple of other things that are worth noting here. One is look at China in 1960 and China in 2010. So, you know, you might think, boy, what did the Chinese do? We should emulate that. Well, of course, what they did was they stopped killing people. Because in 1960, you're in the middle of the Great Leap Forward, and there's 30 million people dying through essentially man-made famine, Mao-made famine, idea. And so, you know, that doesn't really, if it has a lesson, it's not a lesson like, you know, how to take care of people. You don't do that. The other thing is there's some countries falling off the end here, especially in 2010. And that's, of course, HIV/AIDS, which is the sort of other great health catastrophe of modern times, which expanded inequality enormously in Africa. So let me talk about, let's come to today and talk about rich countries. I'll talk a little bit more about poor countries in a minute, but contemporary health improvements in rich countries are, for my take at least, largely driven by innovations. I think of those innovations as, don't just think of them as medical innovations. Perhaps the most important innovation of the last 50 years has been the understanding that cigarette smoking kills people. And so the prevention, the reduction of crowd-state smoking across the rich world, much more for men than for women. So in the US now, the gap between male and female life expectancy is smaller than it's been for a very, very long time, because the women started later and more recently we're beginning to see progress against cancer, which many people are quite optimistic about, though it's going to be very expensive. I would argue this has been equalizing across countries, but disequalizing within countries. So I think you get people left behind by this progress who didn't quit smoking, or who don't get the health care, who don't have their blood pressure checked, and so don't know that there are cheap antihypertensive drugs they could have. But the knowledge of these things has spread very rapidly across countries. So for instance, if you look at this picture, which comes from the book, these are mortality from heart disease. No, this is lung cancer. So this is mortality from lung cancer for males aged 50 to 69 from 1950 through to 2010. So the heavy sort of home bias picture is the United States, the big black line there. And the other ones show all these other countries around the place. And you can see that up until about 1980, these were all over the place. They were sort of increasing and going in different directions for different countries. After about 1980, these are men on the left. This thing has just fallen like a stone. People, men in particular, quitting smoking. In the U.S., the picture is, for women, the picture is really rather different. This thing sort of looks like a crocodile with open jaws. And it's only in the U.S. or one or two other countries where the women's women's mortality rates are now actually falling from quitting smoking. And actually, smoking is going up in a lot of European countries at the moment. So there's a lot in there that we don't understand, but smoking has been a very important part of the story. I can also show you cardiovascular disease, which maybe I should show you first. So this is, again, men and women aged 55 to 60. These are all men, sorry, 55 to 65. You can see that the USA and Britain up until about 1980 were going in different directions. There's a very important and very small randomized controlled trial on antihypertensives that was done by the VA around 1968. And then they started being introduced in the US. It took 3 or 4 years before they were introduced in Britain. And then again, you get this rapid fall in mortality from cardiovascular disease. And you can see it's happening throughout the rich world. Finland, which was regarded as the impossible case to deal with, because men were dying of heart attacks all the time, is often held in the public health community to be the sort of example of how behavior change was promulgated. Well, Finland doesn't look all that different from anywhere else. So, to me, this is technology spreading. And, technology is very important. It's not what we think of it. There's a change in behavior going on in there, too. This is it. So, I think I've said most of this, but so here are these things. This is the increase in inequality in rich countries today. And again, I say that it's sort of like what happened in the 18th century. This is arguably a benign process. There's a lot of innovation going on. Some people get it before other people. There's a discovery, often spurred by need. The politics are very important here. The enormous amount of money that was poured into the NIH, for instance, the support of this innovation. People really do want to live longer, and if they see a way of doing that, they'll invest money in it. Tends to be used first by the rich, the powerful, the well-educated. Inequalities increase, that spurs efforts to include those left behind and help spread the health benefits to everyone. That's the very optimistic story. If you want to tell us a less optimistic story, you might want to know why 50 years after the Surgeon General's report, there's only been this very selective quitting and smoking, for instance. So you would have thought 50 years after that knowledge was made widespread in the United States, it's sort of, you would have thought smoking had gone. And I don't know that we fully understand why it hasn't gone. But this is an inequality that started then. I mean, in 1964, smoking was widespread. And when I first came to the United States in '83, if I'd given this seminar, about half of these people in this room, half of you would have been smoking, I would probably be smoking. I don't know if you know the story of Dr. Terry, who was the Surgeon General, who released the Surgeon General's report in 1964. And they had the press conference on a Saturday morning, so as to sort of minimize the attention. They were very nervous about what was happening. And he was doing his limo with his aide, and his aide said to Dr. Terry, he was chain smoking in the car, which Dr. Terry, the Surgeon General, chain smoking in 1964. And his aide says to him, Dr. Terry, you realize the first question you're going to be asked after you present the findings is, do you smoke? And Dr. Terry said, that's ridiculous. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. That's a public health matter. That's a private thing for me. How dare you even say that? And the aide says, okay, I'm only telling you, I agree with you. So, of course, the first question was, Dr. Terry, do you smoke? And he said, no. And so the journalist said, how long has it been since you didn't smoke? And he said, 20 minutes. But I mean, it's a very good example of the SES differentiated response to that report that people like Dr. Terry were people quit. And it's a bit of a fake story, but nonetheless, I think there's more of it. And just in case anyone's thinking, I'm not claiming that innovation is the only reason for health inequalities. I think it's certainly part of it. So let's talk a little bit about income, because I don't think income is quite so benevolent. I think income inequalities worry me a lot more than health inequalities. let me say a little bit why. So let me say some positive things first. If you look at the US and much of Europe today, we've got economic growth, which continues, though at declining rates. And if you look at every decade, even before the financial crisis, economic growth is sort of dropping, a fraction of a point or so every decade. We've got expanding income inequality, which seems to be expanding ever faster. And we used to think that a lot of countries like France and Germany and Japan were sort of exempt from this, but the latest data suggests they're not exempt from it either. They're much later to pick up on this, but it's happening pretty much everywhere. Now, if you scratch an economist, especially one that's further on the right, they'll say, well, this is not a good thing, And they talk about skill-based technical progress, which again is so partly endogenous. I mean, it's what happens if people get better paid, so they're more expensive, so that incentivizes people to do. That's raised the returns to education. Not a much better deal. The gap between people with university education, that is much larger than it used to be. Well, that raises income inequality because people are educated further apart from those who are not. That's powered up by the story I always liked, which is about power couples. It used to be, if you go back to the 60s, the Mad Men era. These high-earning guys were married to wives that by and large stayed at home. And in fact, there was a negative correlation between spouses' incomes. And now it's exactly the other way. So you've got these power couples who are earning, $500,000 each. And that's certainly powering up inequality. But of course, this provides incentives to more education, which increased educational attainment, at least for a while. And it spread the benefits of the original partially induced innovation. And so you could regard this as a sort of a great escape of this sort. It's creating incentives for the people behind to come along. And it's sort of signaling to them, hey, if you get an education, you do much better. Of course, this is not entirely the right picture because there's some people who might not benefit so much from extra education. We can't get into Penn or Princeton or even into a place where we benefit from this and may not even want to. So that increase in inequality for them is going to be permanent, and they just don't have the opportunity to benefit from this opportunity that is benefiting them. Now, even so, if this were all that was going on, I think it would be possible to view it pretty benignly, like the health inequalities. But now we come to the sort of bad end of the story, I think. So the biggest divergence over the last 30 years has been at the very, very top. So you've got this huge increases in income among the 1%, the 1% of 1%, and the 1% of 1% of 1%. And that was the, Sias and Pickety's data from tax records really sort of demonstrated that in the mid-90s. And it made a huge difference to the way people think about this. Now again, if you're an economist on the right, they will argue that this is skill-biased technical change, particularly in finance. So, if you're very, very clever and you have a degree from Princeton, you can go to Wall Street and, imagine exotic derivatives or weapons of mass destruction, as Warren Buffett likes to call them, from which you will get paid very, very handsomely indeed. Those people are very, very highly skilled. I don't think they're done. In fact, I talked about my book at one of the largest hedge funds in New York City. And it's sort of one of the liveliest audiences I've ever had in my life. They're just sort of abundantly smart people who are coming at this from all sorts of angles that I never thought of at all. And one of them had been like a number theorist from Oxford who was tenured at Harvard but thought it was more fun to work in this hedge fund. And he works for my son at Harvard in his hedge fund. And just talking to him, you don't get people as smart as that in universities anymore because they're all in these hedge funds. So this would all be great if those activities were socially valuable. And there's some economists out there who will argue that these derivatives are speeding up liquidity or something, and making the world a better place. But if you're like me and you have very great doubts, I'm very happy that my grandchildren are well looked after. On the other hand, we think of this as a massive misallocation of resources to finance, to healthcare, whereas there might be better things that these superbly talented people could reasonably do. It's sort of interesting, this audience I told you about in this hedge fund in New York, half of them seem to be different. And when I talked to my son afterwards, he said, oh yeah, that's the other half of the company. And I said, well, what's the other half of the company? He said, well, they don't do finance. Oh, I said, this is a hedge fund. He said they're curing cancer. And David Shaw, who is the owner of D. Shaw, has split the company down the middle, and half the company is doing essentially charitable work on trying to build computer models of how cancer cells grow. So, the standard example I've always given is you guys should not be running hedge funds, you should be curing cancer. And then, at least, so that was me told off. Anyway, I don't think that's generally what's going on. So let me get back there and get. What you worry about this is much of this is the consequence of inequality generating more inequality, which is, to me, is what is of the greatest concern. I mean, if the rich capture the political process and get to write the rules for their own benefit, then we really do have a very serious problem. Now, don't think of this as a Republican versus Democrat argument. It's not. It's just really, really rich people having a huge say on writing the rules. I mean, all the thousands of lines in the ACA, the Obamacare Act, that were written to protect the device manufacturers, the pharmaceutical companies, and all the rest of it. And Mansell Olson wrote about this a long time ago. He said that if countries got rich, this is exactly what would happen. You get these small rent-seeking groups that were very politically connected, who were very wealthy, and who would essentially bring the place down. Or they would slow economic growth by redistributing resources to the very top of the distribution. Now, I'm not sure we're at this point yet, but I mean, we're very close to it, and to me, it's very worrying. Piggy's book has recently, emphasized. I mean, I do think the problem in the United States right now is less wealth inequality than income inequality, or these huge earnings. But of course, it's hard to spend $1 billion a year when these guys get paid. So eventually, these very large salaries finish up turning into enormous fortunes, and the dynamics of that would lead to what Piggy calls capitalism. And of course, wealth inequality will become more expensive over time. So then there's this issue which I still worry about, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit later too, which is, why do we really care? What is it about income inequality that we so dislike? Now, there's some people, and I think Piggy among them, who just think income inequality is unjust, and it shouldn't really exist, especially the sort of income inequality that is today. There's an instrumental argument, which is if it makes people jealous, the people who don't have it are worse off because they're consumed by jealousy. And most people don't really think, though, that we should aim public policy at relieving jealousy. But I think we should. I don't know. I still remember when I was a kid and seeing other kids driving around in really big cars. I was really jealous. And I thought, how much should take those big cars? But I don't really think that anymore, but that's because I'm in the big car. This is the argument that really bothers me. And I think economists have been very guilty of this. Which is, economists like to use the Pareto argument, which they say, if someone gets better off and no one else gets worse off, the world is a better place. And I actually accept that argument. I don't have a problem with that argument. The problem is that economists tend to think of it entirely in terms of money. So they say income inequality doesn't matter because if these people are getting super rich and no one else's incomes are going down, then there's a problem. But if the super rich is being used to take away other dimensions of welfare we care about, like democracy, like public health care, like education, and so on, then, and the problem is most people in society depend very heavily on the government. Rich people much less so. They pay for it, but don't depend on it. Then there really is, I think, a problem for us. There's also these issues that, like Esther and Robinson wrote about income inequality and check innovations on which future growth depends. And so for people who have escaped, instead of helping the other people out, sort of fill in the tunnels or pull up the ladders behind them and just try to stop other people benefiting from this as well. So there are many other historical examples of these processes at work. Inequality beginning with your health to your democracy. Now, I think maybe I should skip to the end and talk about to maximize the amount of time for discussion. Let me skip to some of the global health inequalities. Let me skip here. Because the most controversial chapter of the book is the last chapter, which basically says that we should stop giving foreign aid to countries around the world because it's doing more harm than good. I was very impressed that Bill Gates actually personally wrote a very nice review of the book and recommended that everybody who works for him should read it, except they shouldn't read the last chapter where the book takes a disastrously wrong turn. But I was impressed by his generosity. I think, you know, if I'd been sort of implicitly attacked in the last chapter of the book, I wouldn't really have had very good things to say about the other chapter. Anyway, so, and this is relevant to what Peter Singer is going to talk about here in a couple of weeks. And I've actually, Peter and I, who are good friends, debate this at Princeton on a fairly regular basis. And I think he's completely wrong. So let me tell you why I think he's wrong. So there are these huge, the biggest inequalities in the world, and the most abject poverty in the world come from these global inequalities across countries, both in life expectancy and in income. These are largely driven by infant and child mortality rate differences. So, you know, adult mortality rates are higher in poor countries than rich countries, but your life expectancy at 60 is much less different between poor and rich countries than your life expectancy at birth. And that's because what we're really looking at here is that children die in poor countries by the accidental geography of their birth. These are not dying of exotic incurable diseases. They're not dying of Ebola, for example. But they're dying of things that we've known how to cure or prevent for the best part of a century. They're dying of diarrheal disease, they're dying of pneumonia, they're dying of things that we really know how to fix. So these kids would not die if they'd been born in the United States or if they'd been born in France or Japan. So this in itself seems like an ethical outrage. We sort of know how to fix them. They're dying because the accident of where they're born. We really have to do something about this. I think this is made worse by the fact that children in some of the bigger poor countries that have sort of rich sectors die within a short distance of great wealth in modern hospitals. I think in Brazil or India or something. This first world healthcare system that's not far from the way people saw it. Another dimension of this is that half of all children in India, even today, in spite of 20 to 30 years of rapid economic growth, are severely malnourished, meaning they're more than 2 standard deviations off their growth curves. It's really should not be. And yet India is now classed as a middle-income country, or even a lower middle-income country. And as Peter Singer will tell you, and Jeff Sachs likes to say too, the cost of fixing these things is tiny. I mean, it's not tiny like I could pay for or you could pay for, but it's tiny relative to the U.S. defense budget and what we spend in Bethesda on the National Institutes of Health, for example. So, you know, if these kids were here and we got them here to treat and deal with these things, just would not happen. So, you know, Peter Singer and I are entirely on the same page when it comes to the fact that we have a clear ethical obligation to assess. We must do what we can in order to make these horrors go away. So how should we do this? Now, I changed the order of these slides because I used to say what we shouldn't do first, but people said, you know, if I give you $1 billion, we just throw it away. And I said, no, here are some things we should do. So there's a bunch of things I think we can do to help. I put we in quotes because the discourse in economic development, the aid literature, likes to use the word we a lot, and it's always worth parsing, you know, who we're talking about here. It's often people come through. Usually means everyone but me, or there's no sense of responsibility behind the word we. Anyway, so there's lots of things that I think would be terrific to do more of, which is research on diseases of the poor, the advanced purchases commitments. I mean, one of the things I do with my $1 billion is start a new institute in the NIH that focus like on malaria or TB, certainly, instead of, there is one on HIV/AIDS, but that's because it was a problem here. So there's a lot of discovery that could be done on vaccines and more effective treatment and so on for those diseases. Advanced purchase commitments, which are, we promised to buy 3 million doses of this at a pre-specified price, but we can research with Michael Kramer and others. The World Bank is full of very, very smart people who know a lot, and I think they would make an excellent consulting service after the World Bank has been closed down. And they should be able to assist people on trade negotiations. They should push their knowledge of what happens elsewhere. They're very bad at doing that now because the World Bank will not give technical assistance to countries that are not borrowing from it. And so that expertise is basically not being spread around. It gives tiny amounts of assistance to countries that are not borrowing. And the bank should compete with McKinsey and Gallup and other consulting organizations to do these things. Everybody knows about trade reforms, and that cotton subsidies in the United States are doing horrible things to people in Africa trying to move out. I saw in the New York Times today we're going to resume arms sales to Vietnam. That seems like a really good way of reducing poverty around the world. And, you talk to people like Peter Singer and so on, and they say, well, yeah, like, what can we do about that? So, I'm not so sure. I mean, no one's talking about it. And you go to the countries in Europe, like Denmark and Sweden and Holland and Britain, who are make the biggest noise by giving aid to countries around the world. They're also the biggest arms salesmen. I mean, David Cameron spends his life traveling around the world selling guns, as far as I understand. I mean, are we serious about this? I mean, not serious. I mean, I, of course, don't think we're serious. There's lots of issues that Thomas Plummy has written about recognition, debt acceptance, commodities. Some bund of thugs take over some country. Our current criteria is you recognize these people provided they actually maintain law and order. There's no requirement beyond that. You also immediately are allowed to buy their oil from them or whatever, just because they're in control of the company. There are no rules like that. And these are things like global public goods. So Angus has used the term aid for Africa as opposed to aid in Africa. And it seems to me that not in the form of it. So what I'm again is the assistance of funds or time from rich countries or international organizations to poor countries, what is usually thought of as aid, and which, in my view, is doing more harm than good. So let me just give you the key arguments and then I'll stop and take questions. To me, the underdevelopment around the world is actually not about money. And in most of the countries that I know, it's true, as Peter Singer or Joe Sachs would say, that better health and better health services would indeed cost more money. But it's pretty clear that spending more money on those services as they exist right now in those countries would not lead to better health at all. And the problem there is this sort of chronic lack of state capacity here. And the way I like to think about it is, we like to complain about our government quite a lot. It's a sort of standard thing to do around the world. But most of us pay our taxes, and we get things in return. And there's a whole list of things we don't really think about this very much, because this sort of contract that we and the government have is sort of implicit. It's been around for so long, and even when the government shuts down, they're only careful to shut down some tiny little bit of it. They're not going to shut down some part of it that really seriously screws up your life. So look at all these things we have to do without it, the government is sort of shut down. And to me, it's the lack of an effective contract of this sort that is characteristic of poor countries. I mean, you go to some of the worst countries in Africa or some of the worst parts of India, that's what's not there. I mean, the police are there to prey on you, not to protect you. I mean, they're shaking you down all the time. I mean, they're agents of rich people, and they're distributing resources away from you towards them. the healthcare system doesn't work, not because it doesn't have enough money, but because there's no state capacity to run the healthcare system. And what's happening in countries, and these are mostly in Africa, but there are 2 or 3 around the world. This argument does not apply to India and China, for example. Aid is an enormous share of government revenue. I mean, there's something like 20 countries in Africa today where, according to standard statistics, more than 100% of government revenue is coming from abroad. Right? So why would the government ever do anything for its citizens? Because all it has to do is please the donors. And you can see this over and over and over again. And even if you start out with a good government that has a contract with the people, then eventually you realize there's no mileage in that. And you finish up with a bad government or a government that basically. So with very large aid flows, what we're essentially doing is setting up a system in which bad governments, dictators, and other rogues can basically farm their citizens by getting money from rich countries in order to promise to do things for them, which and this doesn't really matter whether it's government to government or NGOs to people. And what has surprised me in reading this is, this is common ground between a wide range of writers, even Oxfam. Oxfam will not sign on to what I want, which is for aid to stop, because that Oxfam doesn't go away. But if you look at what Oxfam is doing, an enormous fraction of its resources now are being devoted to advocacy of aid within countries. And if you read their rhetoric, they understand this pretty well. I've also been very struck when I go talk to the World Bank or I go talk to Deaton in London. People understand very well what I'm talking about. And this is not unfamiliar to them at all. So the bit that's really hard, of course, is when you do about aid for health. And that's the place where, the argument gets much tougher. Is it exempt from critique? The obvious part of millions of people are alive today on antiretroviral drugs that would otherwise be dead. This has gone up from about 10 million today. Most paid for by outside aid, particularly PEPFAR states and the Global Fund, for which the United States contributes. And, I don't understand that argument at all. These are people who are alive that would be dead. And that's a huge moral improvement where we were before. The trouble is it doesn't suspend the previous argument, which is these large sums of money undermine state responsibility, whether they're coming in for health or whether they're coming in for something else. And I would believe in the long run, citizens must be responsible for their own healthcare system. And you can't run someone else's healthcare system from outside the country. And you can't make the choices for them that they ought to be making for themselves. And you've seen episodes of that. There was an election in Canada where one of the issues was, should Canadian aid be used for mothers and children as opposed to for HIV? So all of a sudden the citizens of Botswana or something had to change their health priority because there's some political fight in Canada. This is just nuts. But the issue, of course, here is just that this is a long-run, short-run trade-off. That, people will say, you get quotes, people say we should not vaccinate the kids just because you don't like the leader. And, I would actually say no, or I'd vaccinate them for 5 years and then say I'm not going to do it anymore. Because to me, you're saving lives in the short run and costing more lives in the long run. And I can understand that people can make different trade-offs like that. So we could talk. I have a lot more slides on why I think aid is smart, but this is just the last slides which summarize the world's much better place. It used to be in health and other dimensions to me that very slim. Health are giving assistance for poor countries, but not in poor countries. And poor people like us need good government, and they don't get it. So good government is one of the things that's really missing for much of the world. Thanks very much.
We have a lot of time for questions, about a half an hour, and I'll take the chair's prerogative to start.
Okay.
One of the missing links, and I'm sure it's there in the larger project, but I'd like you to elaborate on a little bit because it ties together your 18th, 19th century story and your recommendations for policy is public health, right? Most of the examples that you offered were of medical interventions, but if you think about in the industrial era, what led to a significant increase in life expectancy, it was improving the quality of the water supply. It was instituting modern forms of sanitation. And if you think about many of the diseases that are endemic in India, which is responsible for so much of the malnutrition, or in Africa, a lot of it's waterborne diseases, or et cetera. So where's public health fit into the larger narrative that you're
Okay. So there is more on that. I don't actually tell that story from, because I was thinking not to write a history book about more of it. But I think let's talk about the poor countries today. I think that's exactly right. So there's a huge fashion being pushed by the WHO and many other people for healthcare and for universal health coverage in poor countries. And to me, that's not what we should be doing. These public health countries, or I use the word reading, that's not what. I mean, the problem is that there's some chance that governments, even low-capacity governments, can do public health projects. I don't think they can deliver healthcare systems, at quite healthcare right now. Vaccination campaigns may be possible, but a full sort of infant and child healthcare system is, I think, out of sight for most governments. And yet, that's what they're being encouraged to do instead of focusing on these things. Now, from an economist point of view, we really do like the public health thing because it has these what we call externalities, meaning, you can't do it for yourself, right? You can't actually guarantee clean water for yourself. You can build yourself a toilet, but it doesn't help if your house is flooded by your neighbor's defecation during the flood, which happens in suburbs. So those are things that require a lot less capacity to do. And so for me, I'm still a believer in that historical thing teaches us that that's what we should be emphasizing. That's exactly the opposite of what you and WHO are doing, which is they have this non-communicable disease agenda, which is our agenda, not their agenda. They have this, universal health insurance, worldwide health insurance, which is not the problem if these kids are walking around in a kid's shed, which they are. So I'm with you. I mean, I'm very much in favor of that public health, and I think that's where we should be. Now, just before Jerry or someone else dumps on me, I mean, the non-communicable disease issue is to some extent right, because these antihypertensives are very cheap. And if you can stop people dying of heart disease for a penny or so a dose, and it's very easy to distribute them, then that makes sense worldwide. So I'm not against that agenda. But what I'm worried about is, half of the children in India are severely malnourished, and that's not being caused by lack of health insurance or lack of the danger is the government of India will listen to the WHO or whatever. And the current government of India is not very interested in poor people, period. I think that will hurt a lot of people.
I don't think there's much danger that the government will listen to the WHO, but that's a separate issue.
Or anyone else.
Exactly, only because nobody listens to the WHO.
Okay, well, that's a good thing.
I wanted to ask you about your no age restriction. So as a political scientist, I have to say I'm quite skeptical about our ability to know what would induce governments to be better governments. It seems like the strategy of withdrawing aid in order to induce governments to provide public goods sounds really good in theory, but in practice we know very little about how to make governments do that better, and so that worries me.
I'm very careful not to make that argument. I think the argument is a negative one. I actually don't think withdrawing aid will cause miracles to happen. We just have to read any history to know that that's not going to happen. What I do argue, though, is that with enormous quantities of aid flowing to those countries, it's not going to get better. And so that's the argument. The argument is and if you look at places like India, for instance, at some point the donors get fed up with the incredible amount of corruption that's going on, so they shut off the taps. Then, a week later, the Kenyan Parliament, which is not that, forgotten as how long it's in full session, is talking about raising taxes because they're scared of crazy. And so this is great, and then all this happens, and the donors say, it worked. We threaten them, and then they turn the taps back on, and the Parliament gets closed up again, and we hand out new Mercedes to all the cabinet. It's just very, very hard. And I mean, I write a lot in the book is I think we're giving this aid for us.
Absolutely, it makes us feel better.
It makes us feel better, and I think it's, you don't want to use this word too widely, but I think it's appropriate. It's a neo-colonial enterprise that, we're actually farming those people for our benefit. And that what's being extracted is a sort of sense of self-satisfaction. But not, and I mean, if you go to the worst stories are the ones that happen with emergency aid. The one it's in the literature, but I was told this by the guy who became the Swedish ambassador in Zaire when this happened. I mean, when Kagame swept into, after the massacres in Rwanda, when Kagame, all the Hutus, murderers, a huge humanitarian emergency. And every government aid organization, NGO, and they discovered within months that about 2/3 of the funds were going to retrain Hutu militias who were dedicated to going back and finishing the job. So they're effectively financing mass murder or the preparations for mass murder. MSF, which really does take these ethical things much more seriously than most of the other NGOs, left and refused to be a part of this, were roundly condemned by other NGOs. And the new NGO, I mean, eventually the good NGOs all left under this, but there were new NGOs coming in right up until the Kagame killed them. And you can tell stories to that over and over again. The moral hazard involved in providing aid in those situations is really hard. And I don't in the book say we should be aided. I mean, it's very hard for me to say, no, we should not be helping the Liberians deal with Ebola, for instance. On the other hand, if you look back 5 years from now, I think there's every chance that we'll have made it worse. The Haiti things, the earthquake, every right-minded, public-spirited person in the United States was trying to do something about that. And what did they do? They took cholera. Cholera is still there, and well gone. These laws of unintended consequences are very, very strong. So I don't think there'll be a magic revolution in African governments if we pull out, but I think we're doing a lot of harm about it. And some of these other things, when kids from Princeton come to me and say, I really want to do something, should I go to Dakar or should I go to Dhaka? Where should I go to help people? I say you should go to Washington. You should work in our government. You have some standing to work on that. Oh no, there was one back here first.
Thinking about helping those left behind, one thing that seemed missing about the story of the Great Escape in the 19th century is the literal ability to escape, and that is the availability of migration, particularly in Western Europe. And so I think that, I guess to what extent then, if we're going to talk about kind of development and ending these inequalities, does migration need to be on the table? And on the one hand, I can kind of see the Daily Mail headlines, this is a disaster, but at the same time, I think we are seeing, particularly in some Latin American countries, the real effect that remittances and coordination with local government have on local development outcomes. So, interesting what your thoughts on that.
That's come up before, and it's 100% right. And it's really clear that if you talk to most people, and in fact, I wrote the preface to the book very lightly. and it was in proofs. And proofreaders didn't preface, and I wrote about my father and myself and my kids. And, you know, for most people, the Great Escape is migration. Or not for most, but for a very large number of people that track back to families and see how they made the Great Escape. In many cases, it involves a real escape from somewhere. And I should have written about that more. I'm still not entirely sure how I would go about doing that, because it's really hard, right? What you said is true. My friend, now Lord Stern, who headed the Africa Commission for Tony Blair and Gordon Brown about a decade ago, and they had all these Africans and other people talking about how they made Africa. And he was told by both Brown and Blair that everything's acceptable. Anything we can't help, but we accept what comes. If you go to Sweden, the Swedes have let a lot of people in, but it's politically very hard even there now. So, I don't know. I mean, it's clear. Economists will tell you all the time that all of these things have trivial effect compared with opening up borders. So if you really want to make the poor of the world rich, you should open up the borders. But, you know, happen. And the temporary schemes are really hard too, because I think one of the things I write about in the book, which I learned from studying political scientists who write on this, is, you know, one of the things that's driving inequality in the United States is people here who don't get to vote, and even more people who don't participate in elections. So, you know, there are lots of states where you get disenfranchised for life if you commit a felony in the United States. Even in the state of New Jersey, which doesn't have such a law, 30% of prime-age black males are prohibited from voting because they're in jail or parole. So, you know, if we import a large number of migrants who are not full citizens, which is what a lot of those progressives do, we do more of that. You know, we have another big chunk of people living and working here who are not full citizens and who don't get to vote. And that's certainly going to not make things better for the bottom of the distribution. I don't know, do you have a proposal?
I don't think, I guess the political science system says that any proposal to extend migration would fail in most Western countries. But I guess I'm not, it's worth it having a discussion about, I think, particularly if we're going to talk about the 19th century and Pakistan, the countries, and particularly too, just the countries where the surplus population left and what that meant for the people who did stay in terms of political stuff.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about migration too. Economic argument as the highly effective potential, but I'll ask a second question instead. You're very pessimistic about governmental assistance to foreign countries, but are you less pessimistic about or individual charities having their own projects on the ground there? I mean, there's some charity evaluators that try and assess the effectiveness of charities, whether they're doing events for malaria or whatnot. Do you think that those are a more promising approach?
I talk to those guys, and they're good guys, and they really do want to, you know. And also the thing I love about it is one of them, maybe I think it's Gibwell, but I think maybe it's not, who actually will write evaluations not only of these aid projects, but papers that economists have written analyzing particular projects. So they say, you know, this is garbage, their randomized control trial really didn't work, and stuff like that, which I think is just terrific. You know, they're out there hitting where it hurts, where it ought to be hurt. Part of the problem is other people may disagree. This is a very personal thing. I'd be very, very influenced by my friend Sean Graz, who's an Indian activist. And that's the other thing I tell the Princeton students they can do. They can become like Sean Graz. Because Sean Graz was born in Belgium. His father is very eminent economist and speaking for himself. He got a PhD in economics in India, and eventually, with great difficulty, became an Indian citizen. It's actually very hard to immigrate into citizen. And if he had not known Manmohan Singh, who had been a professor at the Delhi school when he was there, they probably would have been paralyzed. So he pulled a lot of strings to become. And he now lives on nothing that I can see. And there are times I've been there where he says, I'm down to my lost 300 each or something. And he lives off the royalties of books that he's written with the Marquis, which, these are not, this is not Pickney or they're not selling for $1 million. So he's been an enormously successful activist. And if there are not too many Indians here, but usually this becomes very controversial at this point for success. People say, yeah, he's been very successful, but he shouldn't have been. Who does he think he is? But he and his boards have worked through the Supreme Court to get the Right to Food Act, or food things. They worked with Parliament, with Sonia Gandhi, to get the Right to Food Act. The National Right to Work Scheme is their creation too. There's midday meals in every school in India now. There used not to be. They did that. They got a Right to Information Act passed, which is being used to tackle corruption and so on. So an enormously successful activist. But he will take no money from outside under any circumstances at all, because it compromises his ability to work with the people he works with. They're deeply suspicious of anything that's going on. So, and if you look at some of the NGOs, I did quite a lot of work a decade or so ago in South Africa when the AIDS epidemic was starting up. And you have these indigenous NGOs, which is sprung up, and then the Americans or other people come in and buy them out, and then they're not indigenous NGOs anymore, and they're not serving the people that are designed to serve. So I think it's very, very hard to do this from the outside. And when I tell the students you go become Chandras, it's effectively, you have to go and become one of them. You can't really serve them from the outside, or that's my belief. And that's why I say go to Washington instead of going to Delhi, because in Washington, you can stop our government hurting those people, and that would seem like enough. Also, you have the standing to speak in Washington, but you don't have the standing to speak in Delhi or yeah. Sorry, Jim.
So I was wondering when you said that we're probably doing more harm than good by giving aid. To me, in a simplistic way, that means that if today we're able to save 100 lives by giving aid, the counterfactual must be that if we were to take that aid away, somehow we can save 200 lives instead of 100.
Yeah, exactly.
But if we don't know, if we can't be certain about a political revolution, a political reaction, it's very hard to be able to say that counterfactual will happen, which is what just, so maybe if you could give me.
No, I agree with that argument, and that's the counter argument, which is that, I would say it would happen a long time from now. It's very uncertain. And so, yes. One thing that might persuade you a little bit is, well, two things really. One is if you look at what's happening in Rwanda, where Kagame is, seems to be very effective for the time being, and informality is falling quite rapidly. But, he's killing people and putting his enemies in jail, generally everything in the way you might expect. And the aid agencies are eating out of his hand. And it's clear they're prepared to make that trade-off, which is they will accept, they will not protest him killing his political enemies, provided he delivers effective health care. So I think if you want to make that choice, that's okay by me. But people are clear-eyed that they're doing that. And, the history, Museveni was the previous Kagame, who was thought to be the Salvation of Africa. The guy in Ethiopia, the guy a couple of years ago, was thought to be the great Salvation of Africa too. And the progress of this over time is not very encouraging. But, I can't promise you that. And I respect that argument. It's right that we're saving lives now. The rest is the thing that happened in South Africa was sort of interesting, because, in the bad days when Becky, and there was no support for the political process did actually fix things. and there were very strong indigenous protests and campaigns and so on. So when eventually Becky left, then it really did come on very well. So I was sort of inspired by that example to say things like what I would do is say, we'll go on giving antiretroviral therapy for the next 10 years, but then it will stop. MSF has that in its charter as well. They haven't actually stuck to it in South Africa, but they will not be permanently engaged for exactly those sort of arguments. It's interesting too, Florence Nightingale opposed the starting of the Red Cross on exactly those grounds. She said it would cost more lives. She mentored that.
Two very different questions. One is, you mentioned the high malnutrition study in India. What do you think positively either the Indian government or international community or anyone should be doing that might be effective to address that? Second question, you placed a lot of emphasis, as has been placed by others, on inequality, breeding inequality in the early 21st century. Why didn't that work so much in the, I said the early 21st, in the mid-20th century or the late 19th century? What's changed?
So the first one, the Indian one, I've been very impressed at work that one of our Expectancy students, he wasn't right, Lee Spears was done there. And actually Modi endorsed his results in his Nation Day speech from the Red Fort a month or two ago, which is, and this is both, he's done these very large studies suggesting that open defecation, well, I mean, it's triangulated, so I find them quite convincing. Not single,
I think they're very suggestive,
but sort of combined. And there's the comparison between India and Africa and so on. I mean, there's different views on this. I understand that, but it's backed by this relatively new biology on subclinical enteropathy, which has been known for a long time. But these kids are wandering around in fecal matter, and they're not necessarily sick, so they don't necessarily have diarrhea and subclinical, but it's actually taxing their resources and so on. So there's this sort of model behind these things that makes it sort of understand. It's not so easy to deal with, if only because, even if you accepted this as the science, Muslims are much better at this than Hindus are. There's a Hindu backlash on this. It's complicated. So like all these things. But I think paying attention to this would be at least one way to go relative to the thing. Julie and I were talking earlier. There's this terrific book by Woodrow Wilson by Alan Berg, who's one of the Princeton trustees. And he's arguing that Woodrow Wilson was basically run out of Princeton on a rail because he opposed inequality. Having failed to make Princeton a more equal place, he went off and instituted an income tax and funded the Federal Reserve System and lowered taxes, or import taxes, tariffs in the U.S. And so I think a lot of people, and Berg is clearly writing this book to bring today's parallels back to them, the way that historians love to do. And it's very interesting. I don't know how persuasive one to find, but it's, which is we've been here before, and, it did get broken. And to me, the way around this, and if you read, for instance, Druz and Sen's latest book on India, the Faded Glory, or what it was called, they're arguing, and I think there's some evidence for it, that local political action, does actually work. And not perfectly, not peacefully. And, that's really what Berg's book is trying to do, is that people rose up to oppose this. And it was people like Wilson who were not exactly impoverished, who, and we don't really know what happened because the First World War came along, that destroyed most of the wealth and so on. But it's an interesting parallel.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your talk. At the end, I was not quite sure what exactly your argument is, or what causal story you want to tell us. Is it that the lack of good government is the main cause of the problems you have described? If this is your story, then one could, of course, further ask, why is this so? For example, Indian political theorist Divergence has argued that the Indian state is systematically moving within a contradiction between development, capitalist development, and democracy, and this different conjunctures and all this stuff, and this causes a lot of changing policies and so on. So my question would be, what role do larger social structural features, let's say like colonialism or its impacts after decolonization, let's say capitalism, let's say the crisis of economic growth, let's say the ecological crisis, what role do these larger features play in your story, or do they play any role at all?
Well, not really, because I don't have to have a theory of change or government. My theory is much more restricted, which is that if 100% of government revenue is coming from outside, this would do bad things, right? And none of those things you're talking about happening. The amount of money that comes into India in foreign aid is like zero. The first part of the question. So it's just that, and the same is true in China. The absolute numbers are large, but as a share of GDP, it's just negligible. As a share of government revenue, it's negligible. So, Indian politics, Chinese politics go in their separate ways, but they're not owned, wholly owned subsidiary of foreign aid agencies, which is true of a lot of states in Africa. And even if the states in Africa started out not being wholly owned subsidiaries, pretty soon, that trough is so attractive and it's got so much money in it that's going to affect the politics. Now, I'm not, in answer to Julie's question, I'm not like, starry-eyed optimist about how nice that politics will work like itself. I mean, come on, Chairman Mao can kill 30 million people because of foreign aid, but I'm just saying that I don't think you're going to get development in Africa while that's going on. So, my policy proposal would just be, I thought it was completely fanciful, but compared with Pickney's proposal for the Worldwide Wealth Tax, this is just dead easy, which is that no country in Africa ought to be allowed to get more than 25% of its government revenue. So that's a silly practical thing. It'd be hard to enforce. Compare with the wealth tax, come on, talking fantasy works, but closer to real things.
We have time, I think, for one last question. Yes.
So it was a similar type of question, and it comes from an observation that I think my understanding is historically often political change happens and it's motivated by the middle classes. And if you look in the last 5 or 10 years, the countries where political change is happening and democratization is happening is essentially middle-income countries. So you think it's plausible that if aid can raise living standards faster, then an equivalent counterfactual is that you get this political change sooner?
It's a good question. I don't know. I think the aid is making a lot of things go backwards. So I don't. One of the arguments that I'm not so sure about, and it's part of the caveat I gave at the very beginning, is I haven't really thought through what education is today. And one of the counter arguments is, if aid were to stimulate education, then that unenslaves people from this burden. I'm not very hostile to that argument. I just don't know what it's doing.
Well, that's a great place to end. This was a wonderful, stimulating presentation, and it actually dovetailed in both the talk and in the Q&A with all three of the Social Science and Policy Forum's annual themes, the global economic crisis, immigration and citizenship, and poverty and opportunity. So I want to thank Professor Deaton for joining us today.